Alexander the Great murdered his best friend with his own hands during a drunken feast. And that was just the beginning of his descent into madness. While history books paint him as a noble conqueror who united the ancient world, the truth is far more terrifying. This wasn't a moment of rage or a political assassination. This was the calculated butchering of someone who had saved his life multiple times, someone who had been closer to him than a brother. The man he killed was Clitus the Black, his childhood companion, who had literally cut down enemies trying to kill Alexander at the Battle of Granicus. Clitus had thrown himself in front of spears meant for Alexander's heart. He had pulled Alexander from beneath a collapsing horse as Persian cavalry surrounded them, and Alexander repaid this loyalty by driving a spear through Clitus's chest while the man was still holding a cup of wine, still laughing at what he thought was friendly banter between old friends. But here's what makes this even more chilling. Alexander didn't just kill him and move on. He cradled Clitus's dying body, screaming and wailing, begging the gods to bring him back. Then, 3 days later, he was planning his next conquest, as if nothing had happened. This wasn't the behavior of a great leader having a bad day. This was the pattern of someone who had completely lost touch with human decency, someone who had become so drunk on power that murder felt as natural as breathing. You think you know Alexander the Great, but you don't know the real Alexander. The Alexander who ordered entire cities to be burned alive. The Alexander who crucified 2,000 survivors just to send a message. The Alexander who became so paranoid that he started executing his own generals based on dreams and rumors. The Alexander who, by the end of his life, was demanding that people worship him as a god, while he slowly poisoned himself with alcohol and rage. The smell of blood never left his clothes. His servants would find him talking to corpses of enemies he'd killed months earlier. He would wake up screaming names of people he'd murdered, convinced they were coming back for revenge. This is the man history calls great. But wait until you hear what he did to his own mother, to his wives, to the children of conquered cities. Wait until you discover the secret that drove him to madness and made him the most feared man in the ancient world. The year was 328 BC, and Alexander was deep in the heart of Central Asia. Thousands of miles from the Macedonia he had left as a young prince. His army had been marching and fighting for nearly a decade, conquering everything from Egypt to India. But something had changed in Alexander during those years of constant warfare. The young idealist who had dreamed of uniting East and West had been replaced by something darker, something that even his closest friends barely recognized. The feast was taking place in Maracanda, modern-day Samarkand, in a palace that reeked of incense and foreign spices. The walls were decorated with the heads of local nobles who had dared to resist Alexander's rule. Persian carpets, still stained with blood from recent executions, covered floors that echoed with forced laughter from generals who knew that any wrong word could mean death. This wasn't a celebration. This was a performance of loyalty, where everyone was terrified of forgetting their lines. Alexander had been drinking since sunrise, which had become his daily routine. His face was puffy and red, his once golden hair now greasy and unkempt. His hands shook constantly, not from fear, but from the mixture of wine and the mysterious fevers that had been plaguing him for months. Some said it was malaria from the swamps of Babylon. Others whispered it was poison, administered slowly by someone in his inner circle. But those who knew him best understood the truth. Alexander was poisoning himself with guilt and rage, drinking to drown out the voices of everyone he had killed. The conversation that night had turned to Alexander's achievements, as it always did. His generals, many of them old friends from Macedonia, were praising his conquests, comparing him to the gods. But Alexander wasn't satisfied with earthly comparisons anymore. He had started demanding that people prostrate themselves before him, a practice that Greeks found humiliating and barbaric. He wanted to be worshipped like the Egyptian pharaohs, like the Persian kings he had defeated. That's when Clitus made his fatal mistake. He had been drinking too, but unlike Alexander, alcohol made him honest instead of paranoid. Clitus started talking about Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedon, reminding everyone that Alexander's victories were built on the military machine that Philip had created. He pointed out that Alexander hadn't conquered the world alone. He had the finest army in history, trained by his father, supported by generals who had been fighting since before Alexander was born. You have to understand what this meant to Alexander. He had spent years trying to escape his father's shadow, trying to prove that he was greater than any man who had ever lived. Philip had been assassinated when Alexander was 20, and Alexander had always suspected that he would be remembered as Philip's son, rather than as a conqueror in his own right. Clitus's words weren't just criticism, they were touching the deepest wound in Alexander's soul. But Clitus wasn't finished. The wine had loosened his tongue, and years of watching his friend transform into a monster had filled him with bitter resentment. He started talking about the Macedonian soldiers who had died for Alexander's glory, the boys from farming villages who had been buried in unmarked graves from Egypt to India. He mentioned the families back home who would never see their sons again. Also, Alexander could play at being a god. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Conversations died away as people realized what was happening. Alexander's bodyguards shifted nervously, their hands moving instinctively to their sword hilts. Everyone knew that Alexander's rages had been getting worse, that men had disappeared for saying much less than what Clytus was saying now. But Clytus was different. He was Alexander's oldest friend, the man who had saved his life. Surely even Alexander wouldn't hurt him. Alexander's face had gone completely white, except for 2 red spots on his cheeks. His hands were trembling, but not from the fever this time. This was pure rage, the kind of anger that made men do things they could never take back. He stood up slowly, wine spilling from his cup onto the Persian carpets below. The sound of the liquid hitting the floor was the only noise in a room full of terrified men. "You think my father made me?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You think these conquests mean nothing because I didn't start from nothing like some peasant king." His voice was getting louder now, cracking with emotion. "I have conquered more land than any man in history. I have defeated armies that outnumbered mine 10 to 1. I have crossed deserts that killed entire civilizations. And you dare to say I'm nothing without my father?" Clytus, fatal stupidity, or maybe just loyalty to the truth, didn't back down. He reminded Alexander of specific battles where Macedonian discipline had won the day, not Alexander's personal heroics. He talked about the time Alexander had nearly gotten the entire army killed by charging ahead without support, how it was Clytus himself who had saved Alexander's life when his reckless bravery almost got him killed. That's when Alexander snapped. He grabbed a spear from one of his bodyguards and charged across the room. Clytus, still holding his wine cup, barely had time to look surprised before the spear punched through his chest and out his back. The bronze point emerged between his shoulder blades, dripping blood onto the carpet behind him. The wine cup fell from his hand and shattered, mixing red wine with the red blood that was now flowing freely from his wound. But here's the part that shows you who Alexander really was. He didn't let Clytus die quickly. He twisted the spear, watching his friend's face contort in agony. He wanted Clytus to suffer, to understand that no one could challenge Alexander and live. Clytus tried to speak, probably to apologize, or maybe to curse Alexander with his dying breath, but blood was filling his lungs. He could only make gurgling sounds as Alexander continued to twist the spear, his eyes wild with rage and something that looked almost like pleasure. The other generals sat frozen, too terrified to move. They watched their king torture his best friend to death, and they knew that any of them could be next if they said the wrong word or looked at Alexander the wrong way. This wasn't justice or even political necessity. This was sadism, pure and simple. Alexander had become a monster, and everyone in that room knew it. When Clytus finally died, his body sliding off the spear to collapse on the bloody carpet, Alexander's rage disappeared as quickly as it had come. He looked down at the body of his friend, at the man who had saved his life multiple times, and seemed to realize what he had done. He dropped the spear and fell to his knees, pulling Clytus's body into his arms. What happened next was even more disturbing than the murder itself. Alexander began wailing like a child, rocking back and forth with Clytus's corpse, begging the gods to bring him back. He screamed apologies to the dead man, promising to give him anything if he would just open his eyes again. Blood was soaking into Alexander's clothes, but he didn't seem to notice. He sat there for hours, holding his dead friend, while his generals watched in horrified silence. For the next 3 days, Alexander refused to eat or drink anything except wine. He wouldn't let anyone take Clytus's body away, insisting that his friend was just sleeping and would wake up soon. He had conversations with the corpse, apologizing, and then getting angry again, blaming Clytus for making him do it. The smell of death filled the palace, but Alexander seemed oblivious to everything except his guilt and grief. But here's what reveals Alexander's true nature. On the 4th day, he suddenly snapped out of his grief and started planning his next military campaign as if nothing had happened. He ordered Clytus's body to be buried with honors, gave a speech about what a great friend he had been, and then immediately began discussing strategy for conquering new territories. The man who had spent 3 days cradling a corpse was now calmly talking about burning cities and enslaving populations. This wasn't the first time Alexander had killed someone close to him, and it wouldn't be the last. He had already executed Parmenion, his father's most trusted general, based on nothing more than rumors of treason. He had murdered Philotas, Parmenion's son, after torturing him for information about a conspiracy that probably never existed. He was slowly eliminating anyone who remembered him as just a prince rather than a god. The pattern was always the same: paranoid suspicion, explosive rage, brutal murder, followed by theatrical grief, and then complete indifference. Alexander had learned that he could kill anyone he wanted and simply claim it was necessary for the good of the empire. His remaining friends and generals were too terrified to challenge him, which only made his paranoia worse. He started seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that everyone was plotting against him. But the murder of Clitus marked a turning point. This wasn't a political execution or a military necessity. This was Alexander killing his best friend in a drunken rage over an insult. Everyone who witnessed it understood that Alexander was no longer in control of himself, that the power he wielded had corrupted him completely. The man who had started his conquests, dreaming of uniting the world, had become a tyrant who couldn't tolerate the slightest criticism. The secret that drove Alexander to madness wasn't just his thirst for power or his need to surpass his father. It was his complete inability to accept that he was still human. He had convinced himself that normal rules didn't apply to him, that his conquests made him divine. When reality contradicted this delusion, when old friends reminded him of his mortality and his debts to others, he responded with murderous rage. After Clitus's death, Alexander's paranoia reached new heights. He started having his food tasted by multiple servants because he was convinced someone was trying to poison him. He slept with a sword under his pillow and trusted bodyguards stationed inside his bedroom. He would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that he had heard Clitus's voice calling his name, convinced that his dead friend was haunting him. The alcohol made everything worse. Alexander was drinking constantly now, starting each day with wine mixed with water, and ending each night in a stupor. His hands shook so badly that he could barely hold a sword, but he still insisted on leading cavalry charges because he needed to prove his courage to armies that were starting to question his sanity. His face became bloated and red, his once athletic body soft and weak from years of drinking and excess. But the physical deterioration was nothing compared to what was happening to his mind. Alexander started having conversations with people who weren't there, giving orders to dead generals, receiving reports from phantom messengers. His surviving friends watched in horror as the man they had followed across the known world slowly lost his grip on reality. He began demanding increasingly elaborate displays of worship from his subjects. It wasn't enough for people to bow. They had to prostrate themselves completely, pressing their faces to the ground while reciting prayers to Alexander's divinity. He commissioned statues of himself with the features of various gods, insisting that temples be built in his honor in every conquered city. When people hesitated or showed reluctance, they simply disappeared, quietly executed by his bodyguards. The most disturbing part was how Alexander seemed to enjoy the fear he inspired. He would make unexpected visits to his generals' quarters in the middle of the night, ostensibly for military discussions, but really to watch them scramble to hide their terror. He knew that everyone around him was afraid, and instead of being troubled by this, he seemed to find it amusing. The boy who had once wept over wounded enemy soldiers now smiled when his own men flinched at his approach. Alexander's treatment of conquered populations also changed after Clitus's murder. Where he had once tried to integrate different cultures, showing respect for local customs and traditions, he now ruled through terror alone. Entire cities were raised as examples to others. Populations were enslaved, not for economic reasons, but simply to demonstrate Alexander's power. Children were separated from their families and raised as hostages to ensure their parents' loyalty. The most horrifying incident occurred in India, where Alexander ordered the massacre of an entire tribe because their leader had referred to him as son of Philip instead of son of Zeus. Thousands of men, women, and children were killed, their bodies left unburied as food for scavengers. When his own soldiers expressed disgust at the slaughter, Alexander had several of them flogged for questioning his orders. His relationship with his mother, Olympias, also deteriorated rapidly after Clitus's death. Olympias had always been ambitious and manipulative, but she had genuinely loved her son. Now, when she sent letters offering advice or expressing concern about reports of his behavior, Alexander would fly into rages, accusing her of trying to control him. He stopped reading her letters entirely, and when messengers brought news from home, he would sometimes have them executed simply for reminding him that he had a family who remembered him as mortal. The end came faster than anyone expected. Alexander's body, weakened by years of drinking and the stress of constant paranoia, finally gave out. He fell ill with a fever in Babylon, and for 13 days he lingered between life and death. But even dying, he couldn't let go of his delusions of godhood. He spent his final conscious moments giving contradictory orders for new conquests, planning invasions of Arabia and the Western Mediterranean, convinced that he would recover and continue his endless wars. When Alexander died at the age of 32, his empire immediately began to collapse. His generals, freed from the terror of his presence, started fighting each other for control of different regions. The cities he had founded were abandoned or destroyed. The cultural fusion he had once promoted gave way to decades of warfare and chaos. Everything he had built died with him because it had been held together, not by shared vision or mutual benefit, but by fear of one man's insane wrath. The darkest secret of Alexander the Great isn't that he was a brutal conqueror. The ancient world was full of those. It's that he was a man who completely lost his humanity in pursuit of immortal glory. He murdered his best friend, not for political gain or military necessity, but because he couldn't tolerate being reminded that he was human. He destroyed everyone who loved him because their love implied that he needed something outside himself. Modern people struggle to understand how someone so young and initially idealistic could become such a monster. But Alexander's transformation isn't really mysterious. It's the logical result of absolute power, combined with unlimited ambition and no accountability. He had been told since childhood that he was destined for greatness, and when that greatness came with the power to kill anyone who disagreed with him, he lost all ability to distinguish between justified action and selfish brutality. The lesson of Alexander isn't that power corrupts, it's that power reveals. Alexander's capacity for cruelty was always there, hidden beneath his charm and his tactical genius. The murder of Clytus didn't create a monster. It revealed the monster that Alexander had been becoming all along. Every conquest, every victory, every moment of absolute authority had been feeding something dark inside him until it finally consumed everything human about him. Today, when we hear about leaders who demand absolute loyalty, who can't tolerate criticism, who see opposition as personal betrayal, we should remember Alexander and Clytus. We should remember that the distance between a great leader and a paranoid tyrant can be measured in a single spear thrust, delivered in a moment of drunken rage by someone who had forgotten that even gods can bleed. The wine stains on those Persian carpets probably never came out. The bloodstains certainly didn't. And somewhere in the ruins of ancient Maracanda, archaeologists might someday find fragments of a shattered wine cup, the last thing Clytus ever held, dropped as he died, wondering how his dearest friend had become his murderer. That's the real Alexander the Great. Not the noble hero of legend, but a broken man who chose power over love, conquest over friendship, and godhood over humanity. He got everything he wanted and lost everything that mattered, and in the end, he died alone, feared by everyone who had once loved him, remembered not for what he built, but for what he destroyed. Hit that subscribe button if you want more shocking truths about history's most famous figures, because trust me, every hero has a monster hiding underneath, and I'm going to show you exactly where the bodies are buried.